There is a field of empty grass in Flint, Michigan, where the greatest car factory I ever knew used to stand. I went and stood in it not long ago. My name is Earl Kowalski, and for 27 years I built automobiles on that very ground at a place called Buick City, a General Motors plant, back when the American auto industry was the beating heart of this whole country. There's nothing there now, just weeds and broken concrete and the wind. And if you stand there long enough, the way I did, you start to remember what we had, what Detroit and Flint and the whole American car business once meant, and you understand just how much of it we let slip away. Let me tell you about the world we lost, because most folks today have no idea it ever existed. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what was built, and it was something close to a miracle. At the start of the 20th century, the automobile was a toy for rich men. Then a handful of stubborn Michigan men changed the world. In 1908, a fellow named William Durant founded General Motors right there in Flint, my hometown. That same year, Henry Ford introduced the Model T, and in 1913, Ford did the thing that changed everything. He put the automobile on a moving assembly line so that an ordinary working man could afford to buy the very thing he built. The car stopped being a luxury and became the birthright of the common American. But the part that mattered most, the part that built this country, came in 1914. Henry Ford announced that he would pay his workers $5 a day, more than double the going wage. People said he was crazy. He wasn't. He understood something the bean counters never could. He understood that if you paid a man enough to buy the product he made, you didn't just have a worker, you had a customer and a neighbor and a citizen with money in his pocket and pride in his chest. That $5 day is the day the American middle class was born. Not in a bank, not in a government office, on a factory floor in Michigan. And that $5 day did something else. It drew men up from the South by the hundreds of thousands, black and white alike, part of the great migration that filled the neighborhoods of Detroit and Flint with working families who had come looking for a fair shot, and mostly found one. My own father lived the glory of it. He spent his working life at the Ford River Rouge plant in Dearborn, and let me tell you what that place was. The Rouge was not a factory, it was a city. Iron ore and coal and rubber and sand went in one end on Great Lakes freighters, and finished automobiles drove out the other. Glass, steel, engines, everything made right there on the same enormous grounds. At its peak, more than 100,000 men worked at the Rouge. 100,000. My dad would come home with the dust of it on him, dead tired and proud as a king, because he knew that what he was part of was the most powerful manufacturing machine the world had ever seen. And it did not come easy, and I want the young people to hear this part. The good life on the line was not handed to us by the companies, it was fought for. In the winter of 1936 and 37, right there in Flint, the workers did something that had never been done. They sat down, they occupied the plants and refused to leave for 44 days, through the cold while their wives and neighbors brought them food, until General Motors finally agreed to recognize their union. A young UAW organizer named Walter Reuther was in the thick of that fight. He'd go on to lead the United Auto Workers for decades and become one of the most important labor voices this country ever produced. That sit-down strike in my town is one of the reasons a factory job became a good job. A job with a fair wage, with safety, with dignity, with a pension at the end of it. The men who built the cars finally got to share in the wealth they were creating. That was the bargain that made America strong. Then the war came, and Detroit showed the whole world what it was made of. When the Second World War broke out, the American auto industry stopped building cars almost overnight and turned itself into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. The same plants that made sedans started turning out tanks, jeeps, aircraft engines, and bombers by the tens of thousands. Ford built the Willow Run bomber plant, a facility so enormous it stunned everyone who saw it, that could turn out a complete 4-engine bomber in about an hour. An hour. The factories of Michigan outproduced entire enemy nations. It is no exaggeration to say that the American auto industry built the machines that won the war. We knew it then, and we never forgot it. There was a confidence that came out of that, a sense that there was nothing this country and its workers could not build. And so we come to the golden age, the 1950s and 60s, the world I was born into and grew up dreaming about. In those years, Detroit was the richest city in America. Think about that. Not a coal town, not a cotton town. A city that built things had the highest wages and the brightest future in the whole country. The big three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, sold something like 9 of every 10 cars in America. A man named Alfred P. Sloan had built General Motors into a marvel of organization with a brand for every budget: Chevrolet, Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, so that a man could climb the ladder of life one car badge at a time. The president of General Motors said a thing that people love to mock now, but he meant it true. What was good for the country was good for General Motors, and the other way around. And for a while, it was so. The company was so big and so strong that its prosperity really did lift everybody. The cars themselves were rolling dreams, long and low and covered in chrome with tailfins reaching for the sky, a brand new color and a brand new shape every single year. Every autumn the new models would arrive, and the dealership windows would be soaped over for the big reveal, and whole families would drive down to see them like it was Christmas morning. A boy would press his face to the glass and pick out the one he'd own someday. The American car wasn't just transportation, it was freedom, it was status, it was the open road and the drive-in and the future itself, all wrapped in steel and sold to a country that had money to spend for the first time in a generation. And what cars they were. The 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, with its twin tail fins and its acres of chrome, is still one of the most beautiful objects America ever produced. Cadillac built rocket ship fins that got taller every year until they looked ready for the launch pad. Ford gave us the Thunderbird in 1955, and then in 1964, the Mustang, a car so wanted that people lined up at the dealers, and it sold faster than anything in history. There was a man at General Motors named Harley Earl who more or less invented the whole idea of automobile styling, and every year he and his designers would unveil wild, gleaming dream cars at the great Motorama auto shows, spinning on turntables under the lights, showing America the future it believed it was driving toward. That was the engine of it all, the annual model change, a brand new look every single autumn, designed to make you fall in love all over again. It sold a lot of cars. It also gave a whole nation something to dream about. I hired into Buick City in Flint in 1972, a young man following my father's path onto the line, and I caught the tail end of the best of it. Let me tell you what a job like that meant. A man with no college, just a strong back, and the willingness to show up and work hard, could earn a real living. You could buy a house. You could buy a boat and put a little cottage up north on a lake. You could keep your wife home if that's what your family wanted, raise your kids, and know that when your knees gave out, there was a pension waiting. The plants ran 3 shifts around the clock. The parking lot stretched to the horizon, and the whole city of Flint hummed with the work of it. We had pride in the badge we bolted onto every hood. We believed, every man on that line, that we were building the finest automobiles on the face of the earth, and for a long time, we were right. That work built more than cars. It built whole neighborhoods of solid brick houses where everybody's father worked at the same plant. It built the bowling leagues and the union halls and the corner bars where the second shift would gather after clock out. It built a kind of brotherhood. You stood next to the same men for 20, 30 years. You knew their families. You covered for each other. You buried each other. And it built the most important thing of all, the thing I miss the most. It built a way for a father to pass something on to his son. You brought the boy up knowing the dignity of making something real with your hands, and you knew that when you were gone, there'd be a place for him too. The future felt certain. That was the gift of it. The future felt certain. And then, slowly at first, and then all at once, it came apart. The troubles came from every direction. In 1973, an oil embargo by the OPEC nations sent gas prices through the roof and left American drivers sitting in lines that stretched around the block, waiting hours just to fill the tank. And Detroit got caught flat-footed, still building big thirsty cars while the well-made little imports came pouring in. The Volkswagen Beetle first, and then Toyota and Datsun out of Japan, cheap and reliable and easy on fuel. We got complacent. I'll admit it. The quality slipped in those years, and the customers noticed. And once you lose a man's trust, you don't get it back easy. The company started chasing cheaper labor, moving the work to other states and other countries. What economists would later call deindustrialization was underway, though nobody called it that yet on the shop floor. We just called it losing. And one by one, the great plants began to close. You can still see the bones of it if you go looking. In Detroit, the gigantic Packard plant, a place that once built one of the finest luxury cars in the world, stood abandoned for decades, miles of empty brick with the roof fallen in and trees growing up through the factory floors. The beautiful old Michigan Central Station, where so many came and went in the good years, sat dark and gutted and empty for 30 years, a great stone tombstone looming over the city. Photographers came from all over the world to take pictures of the ruins. They called it the ruins of Detroit, like it was ancient Rome, and in a way it was, the wreckage of an empire that, not so long before, had been the most productive place on the face of the earth. I had to watch it happen to my own. Through the 1990s, I watched Buick City wind down, shift by shift, until they built the very last vehicle there in 1999. A filmmaker named Michael Moore had already made a picture called Roger and Me about what General Motors was doing to Flint. And as much as some folks argued with his methods, I'll tell you this, he wasn't wrong about the pain. And then I watched them tear it down. That enormous complex, where tens of thousands of men had earned their bread and built their lives, was demolished into rubble and hauled away, until there was nothing left but the empty field I stood in. It happened all over Michigan and Ohio and Indiana, the whole industrial heart of the country. Flint, which once had a couple 100,000 people living good lives, lost half its population and most of its hope. Detroit, the richest city in America in my father's day, fell so far that in 2013 it filed the largest city bankruptcy in the history of the United States. The richest city in the country, bankrupt. In one lifetime, in mine. So when you ask me why an old man gets a lump in his throat over rusted-out factories and old cars, that's why. It was never just about the cars, and it was never just about the jobs. It was about a promise this country used to keep. The promise that if you worked hard and made something real, you'd earn a fair share and a secure place and a future for your kids. The American auto industry, at its best, kept that promise for millions of families, mine included. The cars we built carried this whole nation into the modern world, and the wages we earned building them created the strongest middle class the world had ever seen. That's not nostalgia for chrome and tailfins. That's grief for a way of life. But I'll tell you why I don't end this bitter, standing in that empty field. Because it was real. It happened. Men with their hands and their sweat and their stubborn pride built the greatest industry on earth right here in Michigan, and nobody can ever take that away from us. The cars still run. The men who knew how to build them are still here, some of us, and we still remember. And as long as somebody tells the story, as long as a young person watches something like this and understands what we had and what it cost and what it was worth, then it isn't completely gone. I built these cars for 44 years, and I fixed them, and I loved them, and I do every day of it over again. Now I want to hear from you. Did you work in the plants? Did your father or your grandfather? What town? What company? What years? Tell me down in the comments where you put in your time, because there are more of us out there who remember than this country wants to admit, and I want to hear every one of your stories.